millions of rands and worse, its reputation. Well, even with excellent information, security teams and robust technologies in the workplace that is, the weakest link is often a user within the company that has been manipulated by a malicious attacker who is then able to access the sensitive information that the user is authorized to view. Well, staff are set to be the biggest threats to business cybersecurity. For more on this, we are now joined by cyber forensic security expert Rudi Dicks. He's the director of Cyber Academy 2. Very good evening to you, sir. We thank you very much for your time. Essentially, just take us through staff being claimed to be at the helm of cybersecurity attacks. How essentially is this taking place?
Thank you. It's a often quoted statistic that more than 90% of attacks contain an element of human factors. So almost without exception, even at a state level where countries are hacking one another, they make use of people to gain access, because it is far easier for an attacker to manipulate an unaware staff member into doing something that they should not, as opposed to going up against a well-protected infrastructure with a competent IT department.
Definitely. Take us through the types of cyber attacks that actually can take place.
So specifically focused on social engineering, that's where attackers focus on the human element. And anything from a phishing attack, where they'll send an email, to a vishing attack, which is a voice-based phishing attack where they ask people to do things. They will play on the fact that staff members often aren't educated well enough in what could cause an attack. As an example, we all learn how to drive a car. We have to do a learner's permit and a driver's license before we're allowed to drive. And the same is true for an ATM card. We have to learn how to use it safely, protect our PIN, not let other people use it. But then it comes to the internet, which is arguably the most powerful tool you'll use in your lifetime, and nobody teaches us how to use it safely and correctly, and that's why the bad things happen.
Now, speaking of attacks, you said something very, very interesting just before we went on air, saying that one of the things that your company is involved in is attacking companies for a living with their permission. What essentially is that?
That's correct. I think I've got one of the best jobs on earth. Companies pay me to break into their infrastructure and then show them how we did it and how they can protect against those attacks in the future. I get to travel all over the world and break into banks and financial institutions, again with their permission, it's very important, and then help them protect against attackers. We use the same tools and techniques that a bad guy would use to try and prevent these from happening.
Now, you hear some of these ridiculous stories of millions of rands being, transferred from one account to another, a case in point in a bank. Take us through some of the case scenarios that you've actually dealt with.
So, unfortunately, we can't discuss specifics because of how it works, but I can tell you that we were recently working with an offshore bank, and we gained access to the infrastructure from the outside, and we were able to, without the bank's knowledge, look at transactions taking place, look at people withdrawing money from ATMs and the like. And then we assisted the bank in solving that problem. That specific problem was simply a misconfiguration by one of the staff members inside the organization.
Now, you mentioned something very important. Naturally, when we think of cyber attacks, when we think of fraud, we think of technology only. We don't focus on the human element. So how does your company deal with the human element in training them, number one, with protection policies, and also ensuring that the company is protected, case in point, when an employee leaves and an employee has access or still has access to confidential information belonging to a company?
It's a very good point, and it's often overlooked. There are two parts to this. The first is a policy-based organization, which would be your offboarding and making sure that people lose the access that they should no longer have. But for me, especially having done the actual attacks for a long time and again, our clients have asked us, how do we educate our staff to not be the weakest link in our organization, because we're spending a tremendous amount of time and energy and money protecting the company from a technical perspective, but the human element is lagging. And to that extent, we designed the Cyber Academy, which is solely focused on educating staff members in what an attacker does. It's interesting because it's presented from the perspective of the attacker. So I, as a hacker, explain the tools and techniques I would use against the staff member and what they should be careful for and how they can work with IT to become what we call cyber sentinels and protect.
Essentially, you've mentioned that you've traveled the world over in helping international companies, not only in South Africa, but in your experience, have you found that South Africa is more more prone or cyber prone to these attacks as in some of the other countries that you've worked with?
No, I actually don't think so. I think we have a couple of very talented information security specialists in the country, world-leading specialists, and many people in South Africa are aware. So while we're certainly not at the top of the list, we're definitely not at the bottom either. But I think situations like this, just raising awareness and getting the word out there that this is not something that's going away is the most important part for us.
Now, what do you still think are some of the threats when it comes to cybersecurity, the threats that it could have in our financial sector or state?
So, by far, the majority of attacks is just mistakes made by IT departments. It'll be missing patches, misconfigurations. By far the biggest majority of attacks take place because of those missing infrastructure situations. So what we would like to see more is those organizations doing either self-audits or external audits where people can help them identify these shortfalls. It'll go a long way towards preventing these attacks from taking place.
And what has the response been, you know, just from a personal point of view, when you've actually sat down with the CEO and an owner of a company and said, this is how I've hacked into your database, this is how I've hacked into your servers and how I've seen your information? What sort of responses have you gotten on some of the work that you've done?
I think, unfortunately, it's oftentimes shock and frustration. Very often it's much easier than the client would think it is to achieve success in these situations. And then it becomes an education process. Nobody in the world is in a position to say, I'm completely unhackable, I am bulletproof. We know that, we accept that, but it's a case of getting those companies to a point where it's very, very difficult to affect them in a financial loss or
definitely. We thank you very much for your time this evening. Very, very interesting information giving forth by cyber forensic security expert Rudi Dicks, the director of Cyber Academy, and how we can be vulnerable to cyber attacks, not only from a technological point of view, but from a human standpoint too, on Tech Base this evening.